Good evening. Welcome to this first of 3 installments of the Lowell Institute Lecture Series, which this year at Boston University School of Theology will focus on the nature of civil discourse from a variety of perspectives. Tonight we are delighted to welcome Dean Virginia Sapiro, the College of Arts and Sciences, whose field of expertise just happens to be this subject area. As many of you have already experienced, this election year has gone on ad nauseum, now in its 7th year by some counts, or 15th month by other counts, or at least only 12 days to go by the best count. We've heard a lot of discourse, whether it is civil or not remains to be seen, and how that will affect outcomes also remains to be seen. Tonight, Dean Sapiro, we are very fortunate because we are also using this conversation as part of a larger conversation in the School of Theology, focusing on civil discourse, and our magazine Focus, which will be published in January, has a number of writers on this subject. So all of them are present this evening, and so you're speaking to perhaps one of the most erudite audiences I can think of, and I am delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the school. We're not going to go with a long introduction. Dean Sapiro's work is incredibly well documented. I found pages and pages on the internet. What I will say is this is her field, this is her area of expertise, and we are indeed blessed and have a great opportunity to be with her and hear her address this evening. Over to you.
Thank you. Should I sit or stand?
You can, where you are comfortable. How about that?
Okay. There are always trade-offs in life. There's sitting and having my glass of water. There's standing and dumping it down my front. So we're going to try it this way. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Ted and Mary Elizabeth and whichever Lowell it is who was responsible for this. It's a real pleasure and a little intimidating. It was intimidating. Now it's more intimidating after you introduce the audience, but especially there was a time when I was a scholar and a teacher, and in the past few years since I've been writing memos and reports, I have to say sometimes I sit down and I read the work I wrote in the past and I think, wow, that was actually a smart person. I wish I could do that now. So thank you very much. Civility and civil discourse is a subject that I've spent some time on. The talk I'm going to do actually comes from a research project that would be well finished now had I not gone into administration, and someday, should I have the good fortune to retire with all marbles intact, I may go back to this a little bit. So, calls for civility have become a regular, periodically recurring part of discussion and debate among journalists, public intellectuals, and scholars for a long time now. Much of this discussion involving all points along the political spectrum frets about the civility crisis that threatens the functioning of a democratic society. Indicators of the decline are detectable in numerous places, which vary depending on your point of view, but include certainly negative campaign advertising and debates, cheap shots and harsh invective in legislatures across the country, obnoxious cross-examination procedures in courtrooms, racist and xenophobic interpersonal relations, a breakdown of common purpose caused by the rise of identity and regional politics, disrespect for authority, the collapse of ethical principles and even common courtesy, saturation of the popular media with pornographic and obscene materials, the escalation of road rage, and the ubiquitous presence of cell phones. Which reminds me, Please take a moment, be sure your cell phones are turned off, and feel free not to spend the next 40 minutes texting your best friend, although if you want to tweet about the lecture, I suppose that's okay. Apparently, we should all agree that civility has suffered a historical decline, that civility is good for politics, and therefore, from the point of view of the quality of democracy, we should all join in the call for a return to civility. Perhaps so. A lot of us are certainly appalled by a lot of what we see during this election season, especially cases of blatant lying, of an obvious resistance to listen to anyone with whom one disagrees, of the attempt simply to paint other people in the worst possible light. But I get nervous when I encounter a political idea that is supposed to be good for all of us. I get nervous when I hear about a political idea that seems to rise above politics. You see, for many of us, politics as such is not an essentially bad thing. It is a necessary part of our lives together, especially in democratic politics. So therefore, let me attend to civility with a somewhat more critical eye than is usually the norm. What, after all, is this civility that we have lost and must regain to protect our democracy? Why and for what is it so crucial? And what are its limits? What are the dangers of civility? First, to definition. Civility is certainly widely enough discussed and advocated among scholars, journalists, and the public, but it would take an advanced degree in alchemy, not political science, to draw a tidy definition of the literatures that weigh in on the subject. Nevertheless, as used in discussions of politics and democracy, the meanings of civility cluster around a few conceptual cores, each of which has a very long history. Let me just point to those cores. The Grande Dame of Letters, the Oxford English Dictionary, reminds us that in its earliest appearance, civility indeed had to do with politics, citizenship, the city, the community. Civility was a quality appropriate to the good order of community and politics. It came to be associated with good character and civic virtues. Indeed, contemporary political theorists tend to frame civility now both by the tradition of republican virtues, small r, and by a concern for community, both in terms of social capital and communal and political involvement. This, however, is not the most common use of the term civility, however, and so I'm going to leave it aside for the rest of this lecture as analytically distinct. In another more common piece of the core meaning, civility was related historically to being civilized, cultured, and even sometimes learned. In any case, not crude, primitive, and barbarous. Civility constituted the outward signs, the manners and demeanor, the self-control of being a civilized person. This notion of civility as self-regulated demeanor is very important to current debates. Most critics of contemporary demise of civility fear that we are sinking into a less civilized, more barbarous state because people are not properly governing their own behavior. We're acting out, we're acting badly. Our politicians certainly need a timeout. Third, and very related to this idea of self-regulation, civility has also historically revolved specifically around acts of communication. As the Oxford English Dictionary describes this aspect of civility, it is, quote, behavior proper to the intercourse of civilized people, ordinary courtesy or politeness, as opposed to rudeness of behavior. Civility, the OED says, may be decent respect, consideration. This meaning is an unavoidable part of contemporary calls for civility. The nub of the matter for most observers is that civility affects people's ability to engage in effective political communication and deliberation, which is in turn essential to democracy. Civility, in other words, is the P's and Q's of politics. Listening, turn-taking, displaying signs of courtesy and respect, thus facilitating real discussion and deliberation, which is essential to democratic politics. Most advocates of civility in politics do not deny that disagreement and confrontation are necessarily parts of politics, but only that differences of opinion must be discussed and negotiated in a calm atmosphere of respect, in which, as some experts in the politics of civility say, disagreement remains theoretical and not personal. The crisis in civility, then, is that this process, which we presumably once had, has broken down with unfortunate effects for the functioning of democracy and our fitness for engaging in democratic politics. But the perception of a crisis does not hinge on surface processes of integration. The crisis claim goes deeper. It is that we have lost a common core of principles by which we may be civil to each other. Democratic citizens are therefore engaging in the cacophony of the builders of Babel rather than a mutually understood language of democratic deliberation. So, what's my problem? What bothers me about this talk of civility? First, I'm bothered by the blithe historical assumption that civility has declined over time. Political theorists often read history. Second, while political theorists often read history, they rarely read the work of social psychologists, linguists, and students of pragmatics that can probe the social psychological and sociolinguistic assumptions about actual practices of communication, their sources and effects. Let me start with the latter point, experimental and other observational work on communication and what that tells us about civility. Then I'll turn to political history to examine civility as a historical phenomenon. Although to the untrained eye, the rules of civility may seem simple, say please and thank you, use words not hens, they are in fact constituted by a very subtle and nuanced web of context-sensitive and contingent rules of verbal and nonverbal behavior. As one empirical linguist wrote, quote, linguistic civility is very context-specific. Politeness might be understood as politic behavior, that is, socially sanctioned forms of interaction with polite behavior serving the explicit function of ensuring comity, social harmony, and counterbalancing potential conflict. Rudeness, by contrast, is constituted by deviation from whatever counts as politic in a given social context. It's inherently confrontational and disruptive to social equilibrium. Politic behavior normally goes unnoticed. Rudeness is conspicuous and in most ordinary conversation calls for redress. Now, linguists distinguish between relative and absolute politeness. In the absolute case, an act is polite or rude regardless of its context. In the relative case, the much larger category by far, an act's politeness or rudeness is very contingent on context. Many rules of the road govern politeness and civility. Consider the notion of licensed rudeness. Rudeness that is allowed because its target has forfeited the right to be treated civilly. The classic example is the exasperated bus rider who exclaims to the fellow traveler with the full blast radio or iPod, "Turn that damn thing off." Now, as the linguist I mentioned writes, one who seems to behave rudely according to the politeness rules of the road forfeits claims to public protection in the form of consideration otherwise conveyed to social members. This is why those who are not very competent in a particular language or the local culture suffer the perennial risk of inadvertently violating politeness norms, thereby forfeiting their claims to being treated as social equals. Those foreigners are so rude, aren't they? Perceived degrees of civility depend on people's status and social situation and their relationship to others. It's important to underscore that the variation is structured by the culture, that is the larger framework for language, and status, that is the relative ranking of people within a society. Crucially, for politics and power, people with different status levels can be perceived to be employing different levels of civility, even while they're engaging in identical acts. Those with higher status have more license to interrupt others or invade their personal space, more license to control eye contact, use informal means of address, ask questions, change topics, use space expansively, make noise, make displays of themselves, and so forth. Indeed, impoliteness, incivility, is especially likely to emerge in situations of differential power because of these varying grants of license. Ironically, a lack of conventional civility is also very likely to appear among intimates. Mock impoliteness, such as banter and affectionate insults, may actually help foster or signal solidarity ties and closeness among intimates. When an outsider imitates those same behaviors, they are taken as very rude, or much worse. Thus, Jews tell each other Jewish jokes, and African Americans call each other nigger, and women, well, I won't even tell you what we're allowed to say when we're together. Even individual friendship and intimacy rarely confers full rights to the outsider to join in, and those rights can be revoked very easily. Cultural differences in civility patterns are also important for providing frameworks for understanding politics and civility, especially in the cases of intercultural contact and communication within multi-ethnic, multicultural societies. Linguists find considerable variety in the particular markers of politeness within different languages and societies, or under different circumstances. In some, to be polite requires being direct, where elsewhere one must be indirect. Here, one should not talk about money with strangers, while there, one should not discuss religion. Toleration for interruption and simultaneous talking varies a lot across cultures, as does how much one would exhibit formality or deference or engage in many other ritual behaviors we generally only notice in their absence. Because of these contextual effects and cultural differences, many linguists have concluded that, quote, politeness can be said to be universal only in the sense that every society has some sort of norms for appropriate behavior. Because of the wide variation in communication norms and conventions, one society, culture, subculture, or social group cannot be said to be more polite or rude in the abstract than another, unless one is specifically justified in using a common measure of politeness or rudeness across those culture groups. Some linguists therefore prefer to talk about appropriateness or politic communication, which emphasizes this contextual relativity. A problem for understanding civility in politics is that politeness is generally so thoroughly inculcated through socialization that its norms are naturalized. For most people who do not read journals of pragmatics, the norms of civility appear to have many common denominators. Of course, the norms and practices of civility are imposed not just by culture and status, but by the specific institutions in which communication takes place. Most social institutions, churches, legislatures, courts, theaters, classrooms, have well-known formal and informal norms of communication, and many of these are extremely local. One cannot actually talk about appropriate behavior in church. Compare, for example, the norms of a traditional Lutheran church, a Black Baptist church, an Orthodox synagogue, and a Quaker meeting house. For a more political example, the conventional contrast in communication norms between the British Parliament and the US Congress suggests that the ruffians are to be found in the mother country, not the frontier. It was only in the mid-19th century that theater and concert goers learned to be silent and attentive during high culture performances. The norms changed because theater owners worked hard to make them change. Within ongoing institutions, participants ultimately negotiate the terms of communication, including what constitutes civility. Finally, in thinking about the norms of civility, we have to consider the specific history of the relationship among the parties to the communication. If you and I have a specific history of bad blood or conflict, or your daddy enslaved my daddy, or if I have treated you badly in the past, this will affect our communication today, and it affects who gets to call off our rudeness to each other. People learn from their specific encounters and readjust their patterns of interaction, both to expectations derived from past encounters and, as game theorists have shown, to their assumptions about how much future interaction we're going to have together. Thus, evidence from both historical and contemporary social science research suggests that civility is much more complicated and, frankly, much more interesting for its implications for democratic politics than much of the vast current public discussion suggests. Civility is not ageless, and its practices are not constant across cultures, statuses, or situations. Civility in practice generally requires that different people act differently from each other to be regarded as equally civil. Civility facilitates communication, but it can also choke it off, especially among those who are of relatively low status or those whose communication might call particular attention to themselves or their needs, or might be considered inappropriate by other people. Rules of civility are so ingrained as part of the way people are socialized into their societies and cultures, however, that they do not tend to be aware of the rules except in the breach. They feel very uncomfortable and negatively toward the perpetrator when the norms are violated. Those below do not get to call those above into question. Civility is linked to politics in two senses. Its rules are embedded in the structure and process of power relations within a society, and the norms and practices of society change in relation to larger political changes. All of these observations make less sense of the simple statement that more civility in politics would be a good thing. Rather, civility bears a double-edged relation to politics, and as a central mechanism of social life, should offer an interesting and analytical handle for understanding important aspects of the history of political action and political communication. Let us then briefly look at civility as a historical problem. If civility is socially constructed, then it's also historically constructed. Scholars are widely agreed on this point, influenced largely by the German sociologist Norbert Elias and his history of manners. Elias's study of the fart, among other phenomena, has offered a pungent reminder that social mores, even those attending natural functions, are historical phenomena. Elias located the foundation of civility as we know it in the civilité of the courtly nobility, as he called it, the vanguard of civilization. Facing the increasing dangers of a more complex society structured around more multiple hubs of power, the nobility, Elias argued, was gradually compelled to exercise a strict restraint of the affects and an exact molding of conduct through its increasing integration in a network of interdependencies, as he said. He claimed this especially affected the nobility, trapped, as he said, in the pincer formed of monarchy and bourgeoisie, the surrounding sources of power. The growth of the modern state, he argued, was accompanied by an ever more detailed set of social practices on the part of an ever wider part of the population, training people to engage in bodily and emotional self-regulation in order to help them engage in the more diverse interdependence marking the new socio-political world. Becoming self-controlled was a mechanism of self-protection in a complex world. Scholars debate many of Elias's details, as well as his sweeping emphasis on the rise of the modern state as a cause of the civilization of manners. But there is general agreement that changes in civility were systematically fostered by shifts in social structure and the distribution of power and force. One of the most important and relevant works on politics and civility in the U.S. context is John Cayson's book, Rudeness and Civility, focusing on the history of manners in the 19th century, urban America. Cayson launched an empirically based, head-on challenge to the notion that the practices of civility are ageless, that the United States has witnessed a general decline in civility over the long haul, and that civility is an unmitigated good for democracy. Cayson sees civility as tied both to historically shaped larger social formations on the one hand, and the inner workings of human relations and personality on the other. Also, like Elias, Cayson emphasized the growth of an increasingly detailed code of conduct revolving around self-control and restraint of the body and emotions, although in Cayson's case, the time frame is the 19th century and the place is urbanizing America. Cayson concluded that while civility is, quote, indispensable prerequisite to a democratic society and to everyday social intercourse, it also functions as a check against democratic order because it simultaneously supports social interests, institutions of privilege, and structures of domination. The etiquette book was a popular genre of 19th century American writing, in part because of the relative breakdown of class and some other differences in that time and place led to uncertainty about appropriate ways to act. The ambivalence that American etiquette writers could feel about the relationships among equality, democracy, and civility is evident in the following observation by an etiquette writer in the 1880s. Quote in this etiquette manual, "We are all forced, in spite of individual objections and protests, to put into practice the national theory of equality. We must mix together, and it therefore behooves us, for our own comfort, to make the mixture as smooth and agreeable as possible." Moreover, as I shall emphasize later, what constituted civil, modest, respectful, self-controlled, appropriate behavior and modes of interaction depended very heavily on one's class, gender, race, ethnicity, age, and a host of other positional markers. But the reinforcement of social hierarchy was not the only negative side of civility that Casey found in his historical research. Civility is, after all, about individual self-governance, not the collective self-governance of politics. Thus, social problems that stem from social and institutional causes often seem to be privatized and individualized by the 19th century advocates of civility, and perhaps those of our era as well. As Kaysen wrote, apostles of civility battled for far bigger stakes than how best to eat asparagus. Their enterprise must be viewed with the larger concern of how to establish order and authority in a restless, highly mobile, rapidly urbanizing and industrial democracy. Seeking to avoid overt conflict, they turned issues of class and social grievance back upon the individual. They redefined issues of social conflict to questions of personal governance, social propriety, and good taste, or politeness. The rules of civility mean not making an unnecessary issue of things. But in politics, who is to judge what constitutes making a fuss? Politics, especially democratic politics, has often involved making a fuss. Certainly well before late 20th century and early 21st century commentators began worrying about it. At the most basic levels, mass political action in the eventual major democracies of Western Europe and North America from the 17th century to the middle of the 19th was fractious, noisy, rude, obnoxious, and often physically dangerous. It is no wonder so many elites were worried about mobocracy if the people were to gain more power. There were numerous riots and insurrections up to the well-known Civil War draft riots. In some parts of the country, especially the South and the back country, not only was violence especially common, but it was regarded as an important part of the moral economy of honor, family, and property. A man was not a man if he couldn't or wouldn't defend his family and community by all necessary force. Even leaving aside the decidedly uncivil slave system and the Civil War, the period from the 1880s to the 1920s was also marked by demanding voices, contentious actions, and violence. In the same era in which Edith Wharton learned to chafe from the increasing pressures of private norms of civility, politics was marked by the rise of contentious organizing among urban workers, farmers, women's rights advocates, African Americans, white racists and other xenophobes, socialists, and a host of others. In the 1920s, conventional politics, represented by national nominating conventions, were hardly good representatives of what we might call civility. Surveying the history of mass political action in the course of democratization does not lead one to the conclusion that civility was the main norm that held democratization on course. And political action does not have to be as patently obnoxious as tarring and feathering, throwing rocks, or marching loudly through the streets to be regarded as lacking in civility. Acts as simple and normal in the abstract as sitting near the front of the bus, attempting to walk into one's neighborhood school, or teaching someone to read can also be regarded as highly contentious and uncivil under the right circumstances, as we will know from American history. The fascinating turns of history in which the meanings of actions and words change over time and across perspective mean that some of the crucial sites of struggle over the definition and process of democratic politics happen when apparently uncivil acts, violence itself, can be regarded as civil, and civil acts, ordinary things such as walking, eating, speaking, asking a question, can be regarded as outrageous. Research on the Second Ku Klux Klan offers a very interesting example of how alternative definitions of civility play out in anti-democratic politics. As Nancy McLean has argued, understanding the Klan means surrendering some, as she calls them, comforting illusions that make the Klan completely alien to normal citizenship. As she says, not only did the Klan draw from the broad middle of the nation's class structure, but it most commonly mobilized support through campaigns waged on the prosaic theme of upholding community moral standards. The vast proportion of the Second Klan and their wives were church-going, civic-minded people who deeply feared the collapse of the old norms of civility and community. They were disgusted by the incursions into decency, race mixing, women who turned their backs on feminine propriety, men who abused their wives, Catholics who believed in the hierarchical quasi-monarchy of papism rather than the more egalitarian republican values, communists. They all could see around them not just these signs of degeneration, and they named all of those, of a decent society and republican polity, but also the signs of gathering political power on the part of forces of evil. Black people were being more resistant, economically ambitious, and politically organized, and at the time of that Ku Klux Klan, they recognized that many who had been veterans of World War I were actually armed, and therefore dangerous. In most parts of the country, for most of U.S. history, women could violate the norms of civility simply by appearing in public places, or certainly by attempting to engage in politics at all. There simply was no way for women to advance their interest through politics in a civil manner. As many students of women's political history have pointed out, politics is a public activity, and a woman in public was not where a decent woman should be. Mary Ryan opens her influential book, Women in Public, with a signal anecdote in the form of a general order that was issued by the commander of the Union forces in New Orleans. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies, of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy upon our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall, by word, gesture, or movement, insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her vocation. Women literally couldn't enter many of the spaces in which politics and political discussion occurred without sacrificing civility and indeed all decency. The advice of a 19th century etiquette book for women left them little political potential. Quote, "The best way to overcome the selfishness and rudeness you sometimes meet with in public occasions is by great politeness and disinterestedness. Contending for your rights stirs up the selfish feelings of others, but a readiness to yield them awakes generous sentiments. If it was uncivil to call attention to oneself or make others uncomfortable, women who had to abide by stricter standards of modesty and self-abnegation had precious few options for speaking of their interests." So to conclude, the relationship of civility to the history of democratic politics offers a complicated, interesting, and ultimately very important story. The norms of civility are not ageless, they cannot be applied willy-nilly across time, place, and situation, and they are not an unmitigated good for democracy. But civility is nonetheless an important goal. Having spent some time apparently trashing civility, let me now agree, I've got to turn it around somehow, agree with the vast majority of writers on civility, that civility of a sort is indispensable for helping conversations about politics move forward, but with a difference. I understand civility not just as a means, but as a goal. To make civility a goal, we must understand that in our discussions and deliberations about how to communicate and work together in a democracy, civility must have a problematic meaning. Ironically, civility can only be defined through democratic deliberation, argument, and contention. Civility, as I've suggested, is not a template, it's a process. It's a decision to negotiate a means of communication across differences of view. It is not easy to achieve, and not because people get hot-tempered in politics, which they do, or because they haven't learned the rules properly, which they haven't. Civility is, in fact, difficult to achieve in any setting in which people have differences of status, history, culture, or interests. In other words, civility is by definition of politics difficult to achieve exactly when we most need political deliberation. And we can't achieve civility simply by shutting people up when they see a problem. Civility, or the terms and process of communication in politics, is itself something that needs to be sought, deliberated, and negotiated. In politics, we can't start with my rules of communication or your rules. In democratic civil politics, you can't get your way just because you're more powerful, and you can't get your way just because you're less powerful. We have to make up the communication rules together, which means being committed to listening very carefully and to hear, and that is hard. Achieving civility, for better or worse, requires engaging in political processes of deliberation. Unfortunately, in real life, there is no meta-language for politics. Once we reject the idea that civility is a template that can just be slapped down on our communication to facilitate discourse and therefore democratic politics, we actually leave more, not less, room for democratic politics. Politics is the arena in which a complex, diverse citizenry meets together to make the tough decisions about how to govern ourselves despite our differences and our disagreements. In other words, civility is of politics, not above it. Thank you.
I will say, good save. At this point, we have two respondents, and if you'd be comfortable sitting here,
I
then
would
they'll
be
just
comfortable
take...
sitting wherever I'm told. I'm very deferent.
That doesn't sound right.
You can't win in this game. I'd like to present a newly minted doctor. We don't get to see this very often. Jeff Dornan has joined us this evening after defending his dissertation just 2.5 hours ago. And so, Jeff, we are delighted that you are here, and if you want, take the podium and give your initial response.
Thanks very much. In fact, I flew in on, was it Sunday? And I'm staying with Dr. Wildman, and I brought my third son, who attended middle school here in Newton. So while I'm defending the dissertation and doing this, my son is hanging around town, sort of reacquainting himself with the Boston of his childhood. So I don't know where he is, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I guess I'll find out later. But, look, thank you, Dean Sapiro, for your lecture this evening. As an outsider, I took the liberty to seek out George Washington's advice regarding civility, which he transcribed at the age of 16 from Rules of Civility and Decent Behaviour in Company and Conversation. And among the insights include these: every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Sleep not when others speak, sit not when others stand, speak not when you should hold your peace, walk not when others stop. Shift not yourself in the sight of others, nor gnaw your nails. Put not another bit into your mouth till the former be swallowed. Let not your morsels be too big for the gals. And then there is the last one, which is in a sense my favourite, and which I can relate to very, very easily. Labour to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. Today, discussion about civility goes further than the convictions of Washington, although it may well include them. From my observations of the websites of such organisations as Conflict Research Consortium at the University of Colorado and Johns Hopkins University Civility Project, today's concern is over what is broadly perceived as the decline in civility and its particular ramifications for making society's members less fit, less able to engage in democratic politics. In your paper, Considering Political Civility Historically, a case study of the United States, you put the words accordingly, Dean. Those who see a civility crisis suggest that at the cultural level we have lost a common core of principles by which we may be civil with each other. Democratic citizens are engaging in the cacophonic noise of the builders at Babel, rather than a mutually understood language of democratic deliberation. Certainly, observing the current debate here, I understand the issue, particularly as I hear about, on the one hand, Obamacare and then Romnesia and the like, terms that we would refer to in Australia as the drover's dog whistle. In other words which are heard by the initiated, by the believers, but which do nothing really to inform or persuade anyone else. That said, US politics does seem rather tame when compared with the Australian version. You may remember the words recently of the Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, in her attack upon the Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott, when she accused him in the Parliament of being misogynist and sexist. As an initiated of the Labor Party, and as one who has met Tony Abbott, the opposition leader, more than once, her accusation absolutely registered with me. In fact, it gave me cause for considerable glee. But it did nothing for civility in Australia. My question as a Christian and as a minister of the church is, what does religious consciousness, in particular Christian religious consciousness, provide in this situation? My sense, and I may stand to be corrected on this score, is that currently Christian religious consciousness serves little other than to amplify the political debate. It doesn't seem to add very much. And what I mean by that is that convictions that are often held for other reasons are frequently intensified by religious belief, but not necessarily critically deepened. Indeed, what I look for in religious belief is a tool through which civility may be promoted, through which the other is genuinely heard, and deliberative debate engaged in. In other words, I think religious belief at its best can be a means through which the shrillness of the political contest can be minimised, and perspectives heard and responded to. Enough then of the cacophonic. Having said this, I'm not suggesting for a moment that religious consciousness sits above politics. It is no more above politics than civility itself. Christian consciousness carries within its own political convictions, its own perspectives. But again, perspectives that may add value to civil democratic deliberation. And I provide 3 brief points in this regard. First, I believe that Christian consciousness understands that civility is not without its problems. To use your words in another context, Dean, civility is not ageless. Civility is not given as set in concrete. Civility's rules shift over time. They vary across cultural and status groups. Most importantly, the rules for civility are never neutral. Just as they may facilitate democratic deliberation in one place and time, they may equally repress it in another. In 1989, I was involved in the program of what was referred to as Civilidad, in Spanish civility, in Chile. General Pinochet had called a referendum proposing his election as head of state, which he subsequently lost. In the program, my task as a member of the organisation Evangelical Service for Development, Sapiro, was to visit rural communities to explain the voting process and to encourage a prior process of deliberation. These were the new rules of political civility. This was dramatic, since in an authoritarian state, people hadn't publicly debated for years, let alone voted. And I still remember the head of one rural community in a little town in the Andes called Canteras, as he sought to understand what I was there for, as he sought clarification. And he said, well, look, let me get this straight, Pastor. We weren't allowed to debate before, much less vote. Why the change? Christian consciousness needs to remember, I think, that civility is always double-edged when it comes to politics. That it can equally serve as a means of social control as much as a facilitator of genuine deliberation. The second point I would make is that Christian consciousness understands that it carries within a strong commitment to the poor, to the marginalised of society. To use the words of the Catholic Church in Latin America, the Church carries within its own breast a preferential option for the poor. This can be best viewed as part of the Christian vocation toward humanisation in the context of a politics that generates life for all, not just for some. And as the bishops have said repeatedly in the context of their discussion of the common good in Latin America, that which reflects how society really is how it treats and integrates its poor. To that extent, then, any civility worthy of the name must be a civility that is inclusive of the marginalised, inclusive of the poor. The third point I would make is this, that Christian consciousness must understand its vocation as one of peaceableness. That's different to politeness. That's different to status quo-ness. And this has been a recurrent theme of the Anglican theologian, the British theologian John Milbank. In essence, what is important in Milbank's thought is that peaceableness is part of the altera civitas, of the other city, if we were to appeal to Augustine. It is a politics of harmonic difference, rather than the usual run of democratic politics which agonises in its pursuit of power, exclusion, and to some degree violence. Peaceableness includes the willing renunciation of the practices and the tools of manipulation, of coercion and domination. And it takes up the path of Christ, who finds neighbourly affinity, as he puts it, with those other out-of-power communities that struggle to preserve their identity. It is the civic posture of relation to and negotiation with the other. This sort of peaceableness involves self-restraint. It involves a rejection of totalizing stratagems and rhetorics. It includes civic virtues such as, should I say it, humility, hospitality, neighbourliness, and openness. Dean, Christian consciousness, I think, has the capacity to re-enchant democratic activity. Its peaceableness, its priority for the poor, and its capacity to insist upon a genuinely deliberative civility, not an exclusive civility, an excluding civility. All of those things speak of an inclusive and participatory society. Many thanks for your contribution.
Our second respondent this evening is Dr. Wesley Wildman. Wesley is well known among the ranks of the faculty of the School of Theology, but most recently his work through the Spectrums Project has added a new dimension to this notion of how do we speak to each other and from what places do we speak. Wesley.
Thank you. The old water bottle is a challenge, isn't it? Oh, goodness, this is a great place. Well, the Lowell lectures have the special purpose of connecting to religion and to theology. And I think what Jeff has just said is a very nice piece of connective tissue from discussions of civility, from political science, across to what religious traditions and perhaps even what the Christian tradition has to say. So I really appreciate both of the sets of comments made to this point. In particular, it's so obviously the case when you know any history at all that civility is a cultural construction. It's diverse in time and place. It's a double-edged sword that's used to suppress some people while elevating others. At the same time, we still need the idea, somehow. We need an idea of civility that I want to call effective civility. That is, we need practices that enable us to engage one another in order to solve problems in democratic processes. Effective civility, then, isn't civility in the abstract, it's civility concretely directed to the problem-solving challenges that are faced in societies. Now, that itself is a vague category, effective civility, but I think what it does is take attention away from the need to have an overarching theory of civility and to focus more concretely on the practical. And with regard to what's been said about religion and Christianity, I couldn't agree more that religion at its best, did you catch that qualification? That religion at its best has all of these potentials. I think that's correct, but very often religion itself exploits civility as a means of exercising its own social control interests. It's not just civility that gets uses religion to advance the social control interests of elites. It's that religion itself, as Durkheim has been so careful to point out, has social control interests of its own, which figure into the meaning of the state and of society. And religious groups have been among the most powerful reinforcers of constructed concepts of civility in order to serve their own interests. So Christianity has been on all sides of this civility debate. I'm not sure that it completely is self-cancelling and that you can just ignore religion and Christianity completely on this question, because I think Jeff is right. There is still something about Christianity that in its breast does remember the poor, does exercise a preferential option for the poor. You just can't tell that in America. If you're a Catholic even, you can't tell that in America. You read the Catholic social teachings and you get it immediately. But American Christianity is so strongly on a kind of libertarian version of freedom in US society that marginalised people are suppressed. As we've heard recently, they're intrinsically lazy and they're takers. They don't give, right? What is that? That's Christianity exercising an extremely powerful political voice in the direction of suppressing the rights of the poor and suppressing conversation so that those people can't even get into the conversation to say what matters to them. So, despite all of the negative evidence that makes Christianity look like a shambles in regard to promoting civility and justice, so I want to focus on this idea of effective civility and shrink down the scope of the topic so that we're talking about political processes, particularly in connection with ideology and politics, which is what we're dealing with in election season. So that casts off a tremendous amount of the discussion about civility. So I'm not discounting that, I just need to focus my comments somewhere in order to be practical. So that's where I'm going to do it, on effective civility. I want to argue that what matters most fundamentally for effective civility is, one, mutual understanding, and two, practices of clear and open communication. That sounds so simple. I want to argue, though, that those types of considerations work in a wide variety of cultures and eras, despite the cultural variability of norms of civility. So there are things we can find out using the sciences and other things. There are things we can find out that apply to everyone, everywhere, more or less, so long as you constrain your inquiry down tightly enough, that bear directly on why people take the ideological positions that they do and what practices work to connect what anthropologists would call cultural universals that could be relevant to constructing effective civility in lots of places, including here and now, in lots of eras as well. So what kinds of understanding help us to produce effective support of democratic processes, what I'm calling effective civility? What makes the difference? I'm going to give you a laundry list of insights that come from the scientific study of ideology, political ideology, each one of which is capable of helping one person understand an opponent. So here's one. What if it turns out to be the case that liberals and conservatives cannot run an effective polis without one another? That's what the research, I think, is pointing to. That there's actually a strong need for both. If you have a society run only by people, conservatives, they realise their dream and run all the liberals out of town, you've got very serious problems with regard to flexibility, with regard to adapting to change, with regard to prizing principles having to do with human well-being over principles of managing the energy economy of a social form. And if the liberals get their longed-for dream and run all the conservatives out of town, then where do you get the stability from that's required? The practices, the traditions that are required to stabilise a society in order to be able to preserve wisdom effectively from generation to generation. There is actually an evolutionary background to this point in which small-scale cultures where we developed the cognitive apparatus and the emotional capacities that we have, in which small-scale cultures needed people of both kinds in order to be able to function effectively. You need conservatives, what in this very particular sense, you need conservatives in order to be able to buttress the barriers of your group, to articulate its identity, and to defend it from the sorts of disintegrating forces that are all around in a small-scale culture. But you need what could properly be called, I think, liberals in this biological sense almost. You need them to be able to be creatively adaptive to new situations, to look to stretch a social order from out of its default modes of operation into things that are a little riskier in order to be able to increase well-being and to enhance the prospects for cultural productivity. Those two things are both pressures that you need in order to have a properly stable political arrangement and social arrangement. Here's another thing. In this country, about 2/3 of people are politically moderate. On a 7-point scale, about 65% are sitting in the middle 3 points. That's a pretty important result. What it suggests, I think, some people say it's just that the moderates can't make up their mind, they don't have the courage of their convictions, they should really take a stand. No, I don't think that's what it suggests at all. Our interviews suggest that moderates know exactly what they're doing, that most of them are holding a moderate position specifically in order to reserve the right to themselves to push left or push right as they need to. There could be no clearer sign than that most people recognise that you need both wings of the ideological spectrum in order to function effectively. And most of those people, being in the middle, want to be able to have the ability to push left or push right as they need to on issue by issue basis. When things get unbalanced, they push one way. They get imbalanced the other way, they push the other way. It's no surprise that most people are there. Now there's an explanation for why most people are there. On the political spectrum, psychologists who've been studying politics know that there are particular personality types, there are particular psychological profiles. For example, in the big 5 personality factor studies that have been done across the political spectrum, it's the liberals who love openness to experience. They're the ones with the untidy rooms, but they're also the ones who are more neurotic, the ones who are less happy, typically, more conflicted. These personality studies in relation to the political spectrum have been repeated over and over again. Some of those features are heritable. Twin studies, that is twins that have been separated and twins that still live together, twin studies have permitted a fairly precise calculation of the percentage of heritability attached to those kinds of features. For example, conservatism, authoritarianism and religiousness are heritable at a rate of something close to 50%. Something around 40%, if I recall correctly. And openness to experience, neuroticism, and some of the other big 5 personality factors, they're also heritable. So what you've got is biologically grounded propensities that point in a certain direction that are directly politically relevant. That's why you've got a normal distribution in the population on politics, on political ideology. Because pushing ideological tendencies are not just clear-headed opinions, there are also instinctive attitudes that are partially heritable. There are significant brain differences corresponding to these features. This is very new, it's only just coming out now, but for example, there are denser, larger insula associated with most conservative people. The insula is associated with the production of disgust reactions. And disgust reactions are exactly what you need to protect a group from pathogens and other things. So it's thought that this variation in the density of connectivity and the size of the insula is directly relevant to people's willingness to do what they need to do in order to protect their group from dangerous pathogens, carried usually by outsiders. So the people on one end of that distribution of biological features that particular brain feature are going to tend to push towards protectiveness of their group. People on the other end aren't going to care as much about outsiders. So this is why there are so many people in the middle, because most people are moderate or have mixed combinations of these types of features and factors. Now, all of those neurological, personality and heritable features, they can be contested, regulated, enhanced and refined through cultivation of habits. Everyone has tendencies, for example, towards wariness towards strangers. Everyone has tendencies towards loyalty to the in-group. But you can deal with that disposition in a variety of ways. You can enhance it, reinforce it, say that it's very important, stake your reputation, put your energy and effort into it. Or you can contest it, believing that it leads to xenophobia, to protect your in-group at all costs. Or it leads to racism or some other thing, and you can throw your energy into contesting those natural instincts. So here's the story. You've got individual variation across normal distribution on all of these types of features, and you've got the ability culturally to contest, exploit, adapt, change, mutate, all of those things. So you've got 2 levels of variation. This is a long, long way from anything like biological determinism. But they are biological factors that are shared broadly across cultures and across eras. The social psychological study of ethical instincts has now covered 150 or so cultural settings and religious settings, and it keeps getting the same results. With proper scientific care, you can actually detect cultural universals, and you can start to detect the biological underpinnings of those things. And you don't need to be committed to a brutal form of biological reductionism or determinism in order to be able to notice that we have these features. Now, my point is, to know this about one another is immediately to create greater understanding, without creating agreement. Just to know that this is the way we build, and that we actually need one another to run effective social organisations, means that you have aha moments. It means that you're capable of explaining your ideological opponent to them in such a way that they might actually be able to say, look, I disagree with you from breakfast until dinner, but yes, you just described me correctly. It's clear that you understand why I care about this so much. Thank you for that. We still disagree, but at least I know you understand me. See, that type of understanding changes the prospects for dialogue. It makes possible a kind of conversation that's otherwise simply not available. So the first point I'm arguing, second point's extremely short, don't worry, I'm done. But the first point I'm arguing is that this type of information, this type of knowledge creates understanding that changes the prospects for the building of what I'm calling effective civility. The second point is really very simple. It's just that the practices that we need to cultivate, these practices of clear and open communication, are necessary as well. It's not enough to know this stuff if there aren't any moments for me to sit down with Jeff and tell him what I think he cares most about, and to listen to him tell me what he thinks I care most about. To name the soul's sincere desire in a conversation. I'm not talking about encounter group intense connections here. I'm talking about ordinary, courteous, public exchanges where one person acknowledges that another person thinks differently. I have a great moment of hope from time to time when I hear a presidential candidate say, there is a policy, it's just been named, I have a different policy. It's barely making it over the line of what I would call effective civility, but at least it's pushing in the right direction by acknowledging that there's a difference that's nameable, that both sides are rational, that both sides have some kind of virtues and liabilities perhaps, but you stand for one side and you're asking for people to understand it and to support you. That's just so rare though. It's so rare at the moment in this political discourse where you're dealing with micro units of communication and you only have the ability to caricature other people. So effective civility depends on practices that create those moments where people can establish mutual understanding. These two things, I think, are much more timeless than all of the norms associated with civility. Information about how we differ from one another, and practices of listening and connection that make possible dialogue. It's a simple point, but those two things are much more universal across eras and across cultures, and they can create effective civility. Thank you.
Jeff, will you come down? If you would. It is a delightful and rich conversation to which we've been privy to listen this evening. I want to make sure that Dean Sapiro has a moment to respond to the respondents, and then we're going to invite you to jump right into this conversation with questions and observations. But we've got an amazing panel, rich resource, and it would be a delight to have everyone be a part of it. So if you would, I'd like you, Dr. Sapiro, if you would, just to respond to the respondents for just a moment.
I think they were both very interesting contributions, and I think they extended the discussion a lot, and I would rather hear from you.
Well,
I
that
talked
was
enough.
easy. Questions? Go ahead.
For the panel, what is the relationship between truthfulness and civility? Very often, I realize that truthfulness is itself a problematic term, and it requires a working definition. But insofar as there is this, say, spectrum of truth telling, pure truth on the one hand and outright line on the other, and somewhere in between there is exaggeration, there is smear. Is the attempt to be truthful at the heart of civility? Taking one person so seriously or a group so seriously that one tries to speak truthfully and to contain the temptation of exaggeration or smearing and so forth.
It's, if you hadn't asked that question, I would have.
But you didn't.
But I didn't. But look, can I think it's a fundamentally important question. And I'm not talking about truth in a broad, generic, abstract sense. I'm talking about, and I think you weren't talking about it that way either, it's more about what people do to each other in social conflict. And let me give you an example of, and I was listening to Wesley with great interest, and then I started to think, well, what does that mean in the context in which I work? One of the places I've had to work recently is in South Sudan, and my job is to negotiate developmental agreements between the church in Australia and partners in South Sudan, amongst other places. And part of the process is peace building. And while I'm not skilled in that, we do have people who are. And so we sat down in Jonglei State, which is being torn apart by ethnic tribal conflict over 25 years, not to mention the fights, you know, with Khartoum and so on in the old Sudan, the northern area. And one of the real issues in that conversation, and we had this conversation over 3 days, in terms of trying to negotiate a way forward as ethnic groups, was, well, let's get to the truth of the thing. You have done this to us. And then they would talk, well, you know, okay, but you did this to us. And there's been 25 years or longer of this process of conflict, which has become so endemic, so ingrained, that it's almost impossible to move into a situation of civility, you know, of civil practice in such a way that you can find a way forward. So when Wesley talked about this stuff, I thought, well, that's appropriate for the US. I can see it perhaps functioning within the context of Australia or Canada or Europe, but I'm not sure how it would work in South Sudan. Because the question of truth or lies, the opposite of truth, is all about what you have done to us. How do you justify that? And it's almost impossible to break through. I came away from my last series of discussions, they're quite depressed. And we thought, well, how do we move this forward? So thank you for your question. I'm reinforcing it with an example.
David, I think it's an important question because we sometimes, a lot of us are defining now, we may say this isn't civil because so-and-so is lying or lying about so-and-so. I think you can construct a relationship, you can construct a theory, but truth is far too broad a concept for this, because you could be talking about truth-telling about yourself, truth-telling about others. I think raising the issue of the whole area of truth and reconciliation, there's just mounds and mounds of material that have been produced over the last 30 years or so from a variety of situations where truth hurts, truth is very difficult, and in fact, in the early days of truth and reconciliation, some of the great conferences, for example, that have taken place on Robben Island, there is actually a question about whether there's a trade-off between truth and reconciliation. Yeah. Do you have to at some point say, let's look forward? So I think that's very difficult. I think that there are times when truth is going to create conflict, and it's a necessary conflict. So I think it's It's a great question, but I don't have the foggiest what to do with it other than what kind of truth under what circumstances, and occasionally recognizing that if there's a need for truth, then you're going to create conflict and probably civility issues. In other cases, you know, the everydayness of civility often calls for us not to be entirely truthful. How do I look, David? Great.
Can I add one thing to that? I couldn't agree more with what's just been said, and it shows how complicated the relationship between truth and civility is. But I want to add one thing having to do with social differentiation. There are circles and circles in social organisations and political groups. Truth means something different in terms of an achievable virtue in those different settings. On the largest stage, or on the stage of a debate between politicians where there are fact checkers checking what you're going to say and going to be blogging about it the next day, truth just means basically trying to get away with whatever you can say within the limits of what's interpretable. But it's not really what I would call an authentic quest for truth. And in many settings, such as truth and reconciliation, truth can actually be seriously damaging at the wrong time. And yet, in smaller groups, sometimes intimate groups, without truth, there can't be any connectivity whatsoever. So I think there's a tremendous amount of variation in social groups in political processes, and it's important to find the right kind of truth to fit the right kind of environment. Sometimes you go very, very light on the truth pedal, and sometimes you slam it all the way to the floor and really quest for the truth as hard as you can, depending on the social context.
Okay, next question, go ahead.
I graduated from the school in 2006, and I'm a minister now, pastor, and I'm also a native of Boston. I'm Boston Irish, so politics is in my blood. It's who I've been in my life. I've always loved politics. In fact, I've arranged to be buried in South Boston in order to remain politically active. But I've lost my energy fire. One of the reasons that I wanted to hear this tonight is that my disgust now in political discourse is just on the rise, and I don't have the energy fire. And it seems to me that there is no longer I believe I'm right and I believe that you're wrong. It's I'm good and you're evil. And my professor, Dr. Wildman, has pointed out that we're biologically capable of recognizing each other. It's like the Martin Buber called it the I-thou relationship as opposed to the I-it relationship. Politics seems to be an I-it relationship now. And we've lost the I-thou. And my question is, how do we get it back? How do you pull in from those extremes?
I don't think it was there. I don't think it was there as much as you might be seeing it, and I certainly, I think because of the nature of political contention, I don't recognize a past of political contention that would have the I-thou relationship quite as much, not across the boundaries of party and so forth. So I don't see it as much. I think what you're looking for, though, in terms of some sense that people know they're working in the same universe has come and gone. I mean, I think that's part of the historical period. There are periods where politics was more disgusting than at other times, and more filthy and more violent in the sense of not physically violent, but spiritually violent and abusive of human beings. Sometimes less, but for the same purpose. You know, I sometimes wonder when we look back at times You know, in the post-World War II period, for some people, some periods of politics there may have seemed less brutal than now, but those were always times when, for some people, they were completely excluded. So again, it depended on who you were.
I've got two strategies to suggest. I agree that I don't think it was ever there, really, for this ideal that we project backwards. It's simply an expression of what we long to have. You know, it's the way the Chinese imagine the heavenly emperor. There never was actually such a thing, except for Chinese fundamentalist literalists, but there never was actually such a thing. But it serves as a regulative ideal in their own political practice, which is very important. But in addition to the two strategies I mentioned, information and practices, there are two other strategies I want to suggest. One is empower the centre. So one of my projects involves empowering moderates. What does that mean? Since no one knows in the middle how to describe themselves in a principled way, what they need is an intellectual framework that allows them to say, we stand in the middle on purpose just in order to preserve the freedom to press on whatever side we need to correct an imbalance. That type of schema is capable of giving voice to people who are normally not able to say much at all on the airwaves because they are dominated by noisy extremes. So that's the first thing, empower the middle. A small but modest thing that I'm trying to do inside religious communities could conceivably be extended outside into the wider polis. The second thing is to pray for statesmen, and I don't know what else you can do other than pray for it, because I really don't know how to create them. But pray for statesmen, that is people who create an impression of opportunities that you don't see otherwise. That is someone who enters into a debate and starts explaining the other person's point of view in a way that just never happens. Just spends 30 seconds on it and then makes a point-by-point contrast with that in a certain sense. And it opens up a possibility for conversation that no one thought was possible. Why people don't exploit that as a strategy more often, I don't know. Maybe they're just too locked into the political process to realise that there's leverage in that kind of approach. But that's who we're looking for always, aren't we? The great hope in politics is someone who's actually going to be able to treat us seriously as members of a participatory democracy. That's what we mean these days by a statesman. So if you don't know how to make them, you better pray for them.
Yeah, look, I would agree that I'm not sure that politics has ever been a pleasant experience. I think that it's always been where people have been roughed up, where people have been abused, where damage has been done. So there is a sense, I think, in which we reach back to nostalgia, but it never possibly really existed. Having said that, however, I'd make two further comments. I think that one would be that there are times when things are better than others. I worked in Chile for about 12 years during the dictatorship of Pinochet, and then I was there after that. My brother-in-law, my wife's brother, was pulled out of a shower. He was 18 years of age, soon after the coup in '73. He disappeared for 12 months. And his father journeyed through Chile trying to find him in one of the military camps, asking for him. No one knew about him. 12 months later, he appeared at the house. He'd had his kidneys damaged, he'd been tortured mentally and physically. Now, that doesn't go on any longer in the Republic of Chile. So there is a sense, I think, in which things do improve and do get worse. Although I don't think there was ever a time when things were wonderful. So that would be, the second point I would make. I think the third point I would make is that, and this is all based on experience more than anything else, is that I think there are, good leadership leads to a change in the way in which politics is lived out. And part of my work in Africa, apart from Southern Sudan, has been in Zimbabwe. I was talking to Professor Roberts a while about that because of her involvement in Zimbabwe. And I was lucky enough to meet Morgan Tsvangirai, who is the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, who is a moderate and was part of the opposition, led the opposition, was then integrated into Mugabe's government. And Mugabe always wanted to integrate him in order to destroy him. But I had an interview with him of about an hour duration around about 12 months ago. And on the one hand, you know, there's a sense in which you wonder how this guy can survive. Mugabe is a fox. I mean, this man seems so gentle. But there's no doubt about it, there's been a humanisation of politics, I think, within Zimbabwe in the last 12 to 18 months. And I would attribute it, if not totally, in part to his presence. But there is a sense in which Tsvangirai has humanised Zimbabwe. There's a sense of hope within Zimbabwe, which there's certainly
It's about politics and whether we're civil. There are times when the things we're arguing about feel more life and death, and let me leave aside times of great terror.
Yeah.
But there is, I'm going to differ with you a little bit as a political scientist, there is no single dimension of liberal to conservative, left or right. There's no single dimension. There are dimensions that we roughly say are related to those, but economic kind of policy questions and social policy questions and race issues and so forth, and those don't stack on each other. So there is no left and right that's universal or that is along single dimension. But there are some times when politics matters and we really differ. And at a time right now where people feel so very threatened and the economy is in such bad shape, we have real disagreements, serious disagreements. And if somebody's right and somebody's wrong, pressing the wrong button, picking the wrong policy will have great effects or disastrous effects. We have agreement and disagreement over whether it's okie dokie for women to be raped. Did I ever think we'd see this again? We have discussions about energy and so forth, where whoever's right and whoever's wrong, if we take the wrong choice, it will make such consequential difference. So there's a reason why we're all edgy, because right now we're in a situation where we have a whole pile of different things that don't map onto each other very easily, and they're confusing, and we don't know the answer, and people are scared, but it will make a great deal of difference. So I'm not surprised that right now people are even pulling out the knives and they'll go any which way if they have a commitment to what they need to do. I mean, the other question is, does everybody have a commitment, or do some people just want to be in power? But let's assume for a moment they have commitments. I think that makes it much more difficult, and then we're back into what I was talking about, which is we need rules of the road ever more when they're most difficult to find, because it matters so much.
Go ahead.
You got me hooked, Gina, when you talked about civility being not a thing that we can all agree on, but a goal. And I heard both Jeff and Wesley within the context of that statement that I was still stuck on, because I think it's true. And so both Jeff and Wesley offered practices and perspectives that would move towards such a goal. But you've just disrupted that by what you just said, because sometimes the stakes are so high that the globe is going to warm or it's not going to warm. And we're going to say yes to rape or we're going to say no to rape. So when the stakes are high, is civility still the goal? And if so, what is the shape of the goal of civility and the goal of making judgments that are going to be life-giving for the next generations?
There's the question. And so if it's a goal, and if politics itself needs to be a politics of seeking civility, then we're engaging in difficult work. It seems to me, you know, the questions were raised about whether within particular religious traditions there are the elements of the ways forward. I think there are in most of them. The ones you're talking about don't even happen to be mine. I'm from a different one. I could reach in and find those. But what I do know is in all of these, we have to commit to the work of trying to work together. So do I just want to kill these guys who think rape's a good thing? Well, every time I get that visceral reaction, I have to commit to working in a democratic, I have to recommit to democratic politics. And they have to too. And so there's something I think we need to do in all of these practices and in all of our institutions of forcing ourselves to find ways to recommitting constantly to democratic practice where, and we do actually pretty well because no matter how contentious our elections are, look at the amazing record in this country and in a number of others, but not of all, when after you've had a contentious election, you have loyal oppositions. As a political scientist, I find loyal oppositions the most amazing thing some political communities have managed to do. And going back to the Truth and Reconciliation, I think one of the major pieces of work that's happened in places like Chile and Argentina and South Africa and others is not just a commitment to trying to do democracy, but a commitment to loyal opposition, that we will have to live together and we will have this fight again. And we'll see what happens. So it's work.
And, I think there's a, harking back to Milbank, I'm by no means a disciple of Milbank's, but there is a sense, I think, in which, it sounds very old-fashioned, but there's a sense in which restraint is a very important part of civility. You know, there's a sense, there's a very fine line between the animal and, you know, the more refined human being, and there's a sense, I think, in which, you know, you're right, you know, about loyal oppositions. It's about restraint, actually. And Sebastian Pineda, the Chilean president, was in Sydney recently, and someone gave me a ticket to go along. And look, I haven't got much truck for Sebastian Pineda. I mean, he was part of the right and so on, although, you know, he's perhaps more humane than many on that side of the political divide in Chile. But there's a sense in which someone asked him the question about, well, how's this whole reconciliation thing gone in Chile? And he said, look, we've had to learn to restrain our thought and our behaviour. We have to learn to work with those who think differently. And if we don't, we'll destroy the country in much the same way as he acknowledged it had been destroyed over about 25 years. So, yeah, I think there's this whole question of restraint as part of civility, listening to the other, who by definition is different and, you know, often opposed to you, is fundamental to actually making anything work in society, no matter how strong your emotions are, how much you feel that you are right. You actually have to surrender that at times.
Which is right back to that sociologist I was talking about, Elias's work on the history of manners, no matter what you think about the little details. But his claim was this, that there comes a point when you don't have a homogeneous society that just has a ladder of status, and you get to assert yourself because you're given the status in that homogeneous society. Once it becomes more complex and it's shifting, and you have overlapping and conflicting kinds of power, then human communities began to build in ways of restraining ourselves in a variety of ways so that we don't kill ourselves.
Wesley, did you want to pick up on any of these before we go to the next question?
No, not on the immediate topic, but I will say in our research we have 16 or 17 dimensions of left-right variation. Some of them don't stack, some of them do stack, in fact. So that I think that the actual analysis of left-right things in political psychology is very, very complex, but I do think that there's very powerful evidence that some of them don't stack and some of them do line up quite nicely.
To some degree, I think we'll agree to disagree on that.
Well, you might not be a friend of political psychology.
I am a political psychologist. I was the director of the American National Election Studies at one point.
Dana?
I want to ask Dean Sapiro whether you think there's a point at which the good of the whole demands that we restrict free speech. And the reason I'm asking that is there are two things that come to my mind. First is the Supreme Court ruling that anybody with a lot of money can pay for whatever they want to trash other people in political situations.
You're
even
saying there's a very neutral way of saying.
That's one thing that's,
Yeah.
you know, in the name of free speech.
Yes.
Okay. Another is the fact that people like my elderly parents are terrorized by 8 hours a day of Fox News. Okay. When the people in Fox News say they're just providing entertainment, there are elderly people who really believe this and are absolutely terrified. Now, somehow to me that's gone beyond. At what point is free speech come into conflict or compatible with the good of the community?
Well, rest in peace, my parents would have been terrorized by Rachel Maddow because that's who they would have been listening to. So, yes, we absolutely have to restrict free speech. I agree with the Supreme Court when it said we can't shout fire in a crowded theater. So yes, we restrict speech. Even what all of us would agree is speech, this. How far do you go? Well, we could do the whole as far as, you know, there are a range of those. So there's some level where we have to restrict speech and we draw the boundary at different places, and I tend to be more of a speech libertarian. The other question you raised, though, is what constitutes speech? And the Supreme Court and I happen to disagree and the Supreme Court's disagreed with itself, actually, over whether donating money, especially donating money secretly, is speech that ought to be constitutionally protected. We also disagree about who has fundamental rights. And I happen to believe that persons have rights. They happen to believe that corporations are persons. And some of us here may disagree about at what point do you become a person if you're a human being that has all those rights. But I don't agree that corporations are persons that have the same rights that were accorded by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but they win at the moment. So we have all the layers of it about what constitutes speech and how far, and there aren't many people who would say there should be no restrictions at all. And then we have this crazy business that legal fictions are persons.
Panel. Anybody else want to respond?
Not to that point.
Okay. Peter.
I live and vote in California, and in recent elections on two big issues, abortion and same-sex rights, the invasive investors who act uncivilly and therefore put money into the public debate that is horrendous and confusing are the churches. And so I often think if we could keep the church money elsewhere, the rest of us, both the politicians and the voters, because this is all about the outcome. The debates may be as civil, may be as factual, as honest or dishonest as possible, but it's really the vote that is going to affect my life and the life of others. And so it's an observation, but in terms of listening to a delightful give and take around civil debate, I add concern about civil investors, particularly the church.
Yeah, well, okay, that's sheets at home. Look, you know, I've been around the church most of my life, 30 years effectively, working within it. And what I said tonight was the church at its best. Now, that sounds rather utopian and idealistic. I've seen a lot of the church at its worst. I've seen the way in which the church has inappropriately behaved, unethically behaved in relation to a whole range of issues, which the church functioning as simply another interest group, amongst others. And I find that incredibly disturbing. I find it very hard to live with. I'm sympathetic to what you say. I think all that one can do in those contexts is to try to hold the church to account for why it does what it does. You tend not to hold your job for very long, though, in my experience, when you work within church hierarchy, if you challenge particular elements of it. But nevertheless, it has to be done. It's important. Yeah. The church at its best is wonderful. The church at its worst is shocking. Anyone else wish to comment?
I stay out of church business.
Final question. Final question from anybody? Yes.
I want to raise a question about the diversity, the relationship between diversity and civility. And you mentioned the civility is very conducive, is very helpful to democratic regime of democracy. And I believe in that in this argument. And I want to say, especially USA or in West European country in democracies, there is a big issue. There are a lot of diversity, ethnic diversity or religious diversity or whatever. So what do you think about this issue? So do you think a lot of diversity is conducive or not to facilitating civility in democracies? And maybe I have another question. From my understanding, you interpret civility in the context of democracies, but there are still a lot or several countries who are not democratic, like Cuba, North Korea, and China. So in these countries, what do you think? How to facilitate, how to enhance, improve the civility in this society? That's my question.
Those are great questions. I think that great diversity is conducive to a lack of civility. It creates contention. Going back to somebody who mentioned Buber, people start in a position of not recognizing others as human and have to come to some position of learning to recognize others as human, as themselves. So I think it's in great diverse societies where civility is a problem and civility is an important goal. You raise a wonderful question, and I purposely was, because I write about democratic societies, I'm problematizing civility within democratic societies. In part because I don't know how to think about civility otherwise. I haven't studied it. If I'm thinking about politics and civility, my initial thought is that, like civil society, civility itself may not be a concept that makes a whole lot of sense if you're talking about if you move to a very authoritarian governmental structure, because you have too much control to talk about that. You don't have people being able to contend for each other, and it's easy to talk about within democracy. It's easy to see it present and absent because people can contend. And if they can't, if there's no multiplicity of parties, if there isn't the opportunity for outward display of contention, then in a way the conditions for even making sense of civility, I don't think, fully exist.
No, but there are, in China, for example, as I've travelled and lectured and studied Chinese history and Chinese society, there are patterns of interaction. You wouldn't call them democratic societies, but they're still trying to solve political problems. and they do so in the same type of sort of variegated social systems that we're used to in the United States, with lots of different circles and layers and levels of discussion. And I've seen remarkably civil and remarkably uncivil exchanges in the Chinese context. So I think about sort of 2/3 of what we're used to thinking about in democratic societies actually applies pretty well to Chinese institutions and contexts. But then at the higher levels of government organisation, things are just really, really different. And at the lower levels, with regard to conceptual moral underpinnings, particularly with the Confucian Foundation for Moral Interaction, you've got just an almost unrecognisably different approach than what you have in the United States. So at those levels you start to get really large differences. But in the middle territory, when you've got institutions, exchanges between people, family systems, trying to organise local communities, so there's actually comparability there, I think.
Look, I would just briefly say that, once again, this is based on experience rather than conceptual stuff. I think I would agree that civility is always at greater risk the greater the diversity of the community. And yet, just reflecting in a very natural way on the Australian reality, I live in a community which is 85% Asian. I get on the bus in the morning to go across the Harbour Bridge to Sydney, and out of 60 people, there will be 4 people who look like me. And the rest are Indians, Asians, and everyone else. And it's a wonderful experience. There's a sense of real civility in that bus. It becomes almost a community as people talk to each other. The lack of civility is amongst the politicians, on the other hand, the federal and state politicians, who generally are all Anglo-Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, which is a bit of an irony. So, yeah, look, I think that perception of Inspiro is right, but I think within Australia, at least from my experience of middle-class Australia, I should add, there is an extraordinary degree of civility within that community, amidst its diversity, and possibly even precisely because of it. I'm not sure about it.
Great. And so we finish our time on time. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for being here and really deeply appreciative of this rich, incredible panel. And it's nice to hear a civil word in such an uncivil season. Thank you.